just saw my watch turn to 4 o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Lockwood. I'm a STEM training and development specialist with Boxlight. Train on all of our products to teachers all over the country, as well as develop curriculum for our curriculum platform, MySTEM Kits. Today, we're going to be looking at some ways for you to transition students from Blockly coding to Python coding. This is especially important if you're using our MyBots. Our MyBots have both Blockly and Python capability. So I'd love to hear in the chat if you are using MyBots, whether you've had the chance to experience Python with students yet, or if you are still new to both maybe Blockly or Python. So to compare the two, just so we have an understanding of the differences between Blockly and Python, Blockly is a fixed programming environment, which means it's hard to add any outside libraries or plugins or anything of the sort. And Blockly is really focused on getting students familiar with the primary structures of programming. So thinking about different types of logic, repetition, conditional statements, and getting students familiar with those in a comfortable way. Because so many programming languages have very unique syntax to them, Blockly is a really great place for students to get started with programming. And Blockly is, one way to put it is Blockly is like learning to read before learning to write. So Blockly, all of the structures are set up for you. You're just taking and snapping those structures together. So most people are pretty comfortable with Blockly after they have a little bit of a chance to use it. And maybe you've not used Blockly before, maybe you've used Scratch programming before. You'll find that Blockly and Scratch are very, very similar to each other. It's really just how they look that maybe differs between the two, but the way you use them is very much the same. One of the downsides to Blockly, as you get more experience with programming, is the application of Blockly is very limited. You can use it to program things like a robot, to make simple moves, to repeat those simple moves, maybe integrate some sensors. But if you want to get into being able to do some things a little bit more customized, that's where we need to move into a true text-based coding environment. And one of those most popular ones, and the one we'll be talking about today, is Python. So Python is a dynamic programming language. It allows you to easily add in outside libraries, which means that you can program all sorts of different things, and you can have access to different types of libraries of different data sets and things like that. Because of this, Python is really, truly fully customizable, and it's something that can be adapted to many different applications. Python is probably by far the most common programming language for data science, things dealing with machine learning, and things along those lines. So to reinforce that, just a few things about the importance of Python before we jump into how we're going to make this transition. In 2023, as of August 2023, Python was the second most in-demand object-oriented programming language. So object-oriented essentially just means text-based programming languages. I think the most popular was JavaScript in 2023, but Python is rapidly taking over as the most popular programming language. And if you have been listening to the news or reading articles in the paper, anything like that, you'll know that artificial intelligence is taking over everything now. And it turns out that Python is, for the most part, the most common language that most artificial intelligence models are programmed using. So getting students familiar with a text-based programming language, Python is one of those most important ones for students who are looking to jump right into a career field that has tons and tons of demand at the current time. So looking at how we can make this transition. So Blockly coding, students are taking pre-made segments of code, snapping them together like a puzzle to do different things. Through Blockly, we should have the ability to introduce students to some of the really big key concepts for just programming in general. And I've narrowed it down to 5 things. Those 5 things are variables, which are things like integers or strings. We've got conditional statements. So looking at things like a while statement or an if statement, we've got loops, functions, lists. Right? And these are all things that we're able to do in Blockly. And when we start to make this transition for students, one of the easiest ways to do this is to get students realizing what the text-based code looks like when they're using one of these pre-made components in Blockly. Right, so in this example here, we can actually show both in the Fusion interface as well as just in the plain Blockly environment that you can find online. You have the ability to show side by side both block coding with Blockly as well as the script based or the written programming language of Python. So looking at this image, we can see a comparable Python code to a comparable Blockly code. And what we see is that there's specific segments of Python code that align with those block coding. And we want to do this around things that students are familiar with or around these key concepts. So as we start to introduce students to variables, we want to look at how a variable is defined in Python and compare that to how it's defined in Blockly. If we're looking at conditional statements like this while loop that we see in the green block, right, we want to see how that is written out in Python coding. Or if we want to look at something like um, a function, right? We can look and see how that's written out in Python coding as well. Once students are familiar just seeing what Python code is generated by block-based coding or Blockly coding, this is where you can then start to challenge students to replicate one language in the other language, right? So looking at a simple thing like printing out a text statement. Right? In Blockly, you can use the print block. You can type whatever you want between those quotation marks. Right? And have students try to replicate things, right? So have students try to write in Python-based code what that equivalent segment of Python code would be to equate to the block code. And you can do this in both directions, right? You can give students a segment of Blockly code and have them try to mimic or replicate in Python, or give them a segment of Python code and have them try to replicate in Blockly. Another way of doing this is to have students predict and understand outputs of code. And this is something that you can start early on, even before making the transition into Python. You can start this when dealing with Blockly and have students look at a segment of block code and then transition or try to understand what the output of that code might be, right? So if I gave students this example and this is a segment of Python code, I want students to try to make predictions of what I'm going to get as an output if I were to run this one segment of code, right? Does anybody want to take a guess in the chat what the output would be? Give you a couple seconds here to look at it. So if I ran this Python code, anybody think they can take a stab at what the code might look like? Let's just say we start at 0. That's a good question. Yeah, there's not a repeat. No repeats in here. So all this would print out is if we started at 0, I'd just print 1. So there's definitely some things in here that might mislead students into thinking it's going to print out, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then print count too high. But we're looking to have students understand that there's small differences in code and understand what those differences will result in when they output to Python code. Another way to make this transition is to have students look at both types of code side by side, right, and see if there's equivalencies between the two different pieces of code, right? So if we're looking at a set of Blockly code and a segment of Python code, do the two different codes match up with each other? Right? So when we're looking at this, we're having students both understand what the output of the code might be, but also understand the differences between both Python and Blockly code. Right? And the transition to Python for many students is going to be challenging, right? Before they've been very familiar with this very easy click and drag and substitute in different already pre-made blocks of code. But when you make this transition to Python, it's like learning a brand new language. Right? There's specific syntax when it comes to Python, like having parentheses, having colons at the end of different things, having quotation marks versus like an apostrophe. These are all different things that students have to learn, and most of it comes through trial and error. Right? Just like learning language and learning grammar, right? We learn by trial and error through uh, speaking and through writing. Python is no different than that. So when you're teaching Python to students, you truly are teaching a foreign language. Sorry, my dogs are going wild. So when you're teaching that to students, you really have to think as if you're teaching a foreign language. Right? If you've ever taken a foreign language before, you know that learning a foreign language is very broken down to very, very minute details of the language, and you learn about small pieces at a time. Right? That's why going back to those very important things, like conditional statements, like variables, are very important to make that transition. Right? So if your students are not at the point where they understand what a conditional statement is, or they understand what a loop is, or they understand what a variable is, they're probably not ready at that point to make the transition to Python. But at that point in time, if students are comfortable coding and just don't understand those things, that's a good time to start working with students to actually make those connections and start to connect these vocabulary words with those things that they're already doing and understand how they work. Right. And like I said at the beginning, Blockly coding is very much like learning to read before learning to write. Right? Many students, or sorry, learning to speak before learning to write. Right? Many students can start speaking when they're 1 or 2 years old, but they don't start to write until they're 4 or 5. Um, and Blockly is very much that same way. Right? You can make the code work in the way you want, but maybe you don't fully understand what the code is truly doing behind the scenes. Right? And that transition to Python is really going to help students understand what's happening behind the scenes um, when they are selecting a specific block. And like Hannah said in the chat, this is a very good way to get students to develop attention to detail. The smallest things can make an error in your code and make things not turn out right. Right? So you have to be very, very explicit as you go through and write this code. Um, but at the very beginning, it's very helpful to see both side by side, just so you know what works and what doesn't work. Right? And yeah, and Hannah beat me to it. I was going to mention as well, as you start to do this, it's great to have students pair up and review each other's code. Right? Whenever you're working, even in a professional setting with programming, all programmers typically work in a team environment where they are writing a segment of code and submitting it to somebody else for essentially proofreading. Right? No different than you might do if you're in an English class and you're writing a paragraph, have somebody else proofread it before you submit it. It's the same idea when it comes to coding. All right. So hopefully that's a good idea of if your students are ready to make the transition and some things you can do to start making that transition. If you're looking for more resources on making this transition, I encourage you to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to share some different resources with you that you can use with students in making the transition to Python. Before doing this with students, you also want to make sure that you yourself, as a teacher, are very comfortable with Python, so you don't get uh, confused and misunderstand student questions and things like that. So I'm going to put my email in the chat just so you have my email. If you'd like to reach out, I'd be more than happy to provide you with some additional resources. But today was meant to just be a quick overview of how we can start thinking about making that transition. On future Wednesdays, we might dive a little bit deeper into some more specifics of how to make those changes and some specific activities that you can do with students. But I appreciate you for spending time with us today. And I'll remain on the call here if we have any questions. If you would like to post them in the chat, I'd love to be able to answer them for you. Before I forget, next week, if you'd like to join us next week, Hannah is going to be presenting a learning lab focused on using the Scribble tool on Blockly. And Hannah was showing me some of the cool designs that she was making earlier this week in preparation for next week. So if you are working with students, especially younger students, and you're looking to make things like Christmas ornaments or different things that you might not be able to design in Tinkercad with basic shapes, and you want to have a little bit more creativity and freehand design, Hannah's going to be covering that tool for us next week.
Yeah, warning, I had a lot of fun planning it. There is so much cool going on. So hope to see you there. But Jonathan, I got a lot of good ideas from your session, and rather than type it in the chat, I thought I'd just come off mute and say hello. I think your idea of like having students try to recreate something either in block from Python to Blockly or Blockly to Python is really good. And I feel like that could be really nice for matching activities on like student handouts, or even have students like trade up with a partner and have one of them create a code and see if the other one can recreate it for them, and then like trade with each other and see how that works. That's what you prompted me with this session.
Yeah, that's definitely a great idea. When you're partnering up students, it's definitely good to partner students maybe of mixed abilities. So if you have students that are a little bit more experienced, pair them with a student that's a little bit less experienced. And that'll definitely help both of the students grow together because they'll be able to provide feedback to each other in that setting.
Yeah, and then the other thing you were saying about, working with codes they're already familiar with. So if they're not familiar with conditionals and variables and all that stuff, just looking at how you control the motors and do route following, just like you do in Blockly as a first project, is also like super solid. They can see how, okay, this is how I control a motor. Now let's see if I can do a route. So I think that was a good takeaway from me as well.
Yeah, definitely taking things that you know already work. So if you have a segment of code that you were using with the MyBot and you know the MyBot drives and does what you want it to do, take that Python code that's generated and try to just make a couple small changes to that code. Maybe just change the speed of the motors, change the direction the motors run. So maybe it runs the entire thing backwards. Rather, you don't want to ever start out just completely in the open and try to start from scratch and build Python code with no experience and not knowing what works and what doesn't.
Exactly. Anytime I've done the little bit of Python I've played with is I've built it in Blockly, seen how the code works, figured out how to like read Python on the right hand side because you can show them on both on the screen at the same time. And then it's like, okay, now once I can read it, once I understand what it's trying to do, it's just a lot of copy pasting and like figuring out how to tweak it. Can I make it go faster? Can I make it go slower? Like those baby steps of okay, give me a good starting point, a good framework, and then start challenging myself. So I'm excited to explore more with this interface because I've mostly just stuck in Blockly so far.
Right. I don't see any questions in the chat. So once again, if you are interested in learning more about the Scribble tool in Tinkercad and doing some freehand designs and expressing a little bit of creativity in Tinkercad, please join us next week for Hannah's 20-minute session on Scribble tool. But thank you everybody for coming today, and I hope you have a good rest of your week.